Hi, I'm Reuben Cohen.
I'm Gavin Larson.
And can you believe together we have a combined 5 decades of working experience, working in all genres of music. We're very fortunate that so many popular projects have come our way that have won Grammys and platinum status. And today we have a lot to share with you.
Through the methodology of our analog console, which really is years in the making and well thought out and developed, we've now entered the digital world. We have a plugin that a lot of people know us for through IK Multimedia called the LMC, which is really a mimic of this console. It took us a year to design it. Since there's no bus processing in the world of immersive work, what Reuben did is he came up with a methodology to trick the computer into thinking there's a bus. He calls it the phantom bus. He's going to sit down with Warren right now and talk you through it.
Hi, Reuben.
Hi, Warren.
How are you?
Good. Good to see you in the flesh.
I know, it's good to be seen in the flesh.
Absolutely.
This used to be your editing room.
That's right. We used to do all of the editing post our mastering process. We deliver refs, assembly of the albums, spacing, fades, dry out, no noise, all the things you'd expect.
Did you say it was 714, is that correct?
714, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So we can monitor full immersive, anything we want. We can use this room for 5.1, we can do channel-based 5.1, channel-based 714, and also full Dolby Atmos, Sony 360, you name it, all
Excellent.
capable.
What you and I were talking about on the phone was like, I've been fortunate enough to hang out with a lot of people that have been mixing in Atmos. I've not spoken to anybody who's mastering in Atmos. And I've had very different experiences, all fantastic, with Dave Way and Brad Wood, Steve Genowick, and most recently, just a couple of weeks ago with Bob Clearmountain. And what I enjoyed about Bob's approach, I mean, all of these guys are fantastic, but what I liked about Bob's approach was I felt like I was sitting inside of the song. I wasn't relying on like a trickery, like, oh, here's a tambourine over here and here's a guitar moving around. It really felt like an expanded stereo mix. And when I said that to him, he was pleased. He was like, that's what I want. You have come up with the system, which from what I've just been listening to, is very much in that same world.
What it really is it's the ability to use a bus without a bus. Because in the world, maybe what you're kind of referring to, all of stereo work in terms of how we as mastering engineers do what we do has to do with the inclusion of a master bus, right? In other words, we can put processing on the channel itself. We can EQ into compression and then compress into further compression and then have that feed a limiter. And all of these processes work in series to work as a global, in concert with one another to achieve musicality. So you can work up against compression with EQ and you can dial it back and that compression will release musically so that then you can come back again. All of those techniques that, we as mastering engineers use rely on the fact that you have a stereo bus. Or even in channel-based immersive formats like 5.1 or 714, that still has the ability, you still have the ability to put the processing on the channel itself because all of these feeds are summing to a channel. So it's very convenient just to put the processing on the channel. In object-based audio and immersive, the new object-based formats, there is no real bus to sum everything to and then put the channel, the processing on the channel itself because there are no channels. It's channel agnostic. Right. So how are we able to achieve all of the musicality that we have really evolved into or throughout the years with the absence of a bus? What I'm going to show you here is a solution for that, to create what I refer to as a phantom bus. The way we work in stereo, and I know you're very familiar with Gavin's and my work, we rely on all these things very much, and people know us for that type of thing. So I was very driven to try to find that type of solution because all of the musicality that we can introduce in our processes is quite limited in mastering in this new world. So this bridges the gap. And once you have all the routing set up, you can really do whatever you want. Any mastering engineer can do whatever they want in terms of you can EQ into compression and have those two things know about each other, or you can compress into EQ and have those two things interrelate. And I'll explain why that's such a hurdle without a solution like this and how we bridge that using a solution like this.
I love this idea. I mean, we were talking about with Bob the other day, he's taking his master bus and then controlling 16 compressors.
Yes.
To have a sort of a feeling that I just heard a minute ago when you played back the track off camera. This really seems like the solution. I like the trickery and the fantastic things that we can do with immersive, but not everybody's going to have a system which exaggerates that. You know what I mean? They're not going to be like, oh, the tambourine, etc., is just over here in this one place, in this one speaker. I want to feel like I can put on a pair of headphones and I can experience it with spatial, with all, how many different formats now are we talking with immersive? It's enormous, isn't it? So,
Absolutely.
So it needs to be something that works universally. And from everything you've been telling me about, this seems to be the solution.
It's
bringing a universality to it.
It could be, and the applications of it, we'll see what happens in the future, because it's not beholden to any format whatsoever, or any workstation you can do with this hypothetically in Pro Tools, Logic, you name it.
Yeah.
It's agnostic to all of that.
I like that.
It's special for that reason.
Okay, well, I'm going to sort of be quiet now.
Sure.
Why don't you tell us a bit about this?
Okay, so a little further on why we don't have a bus in immersive object-based audio formats is that there's nothing that's summing anything. You have objects or a bed that are all just pointing to coordinates in space, and then you can encode it that way until then it's later decoded and played back in whatever configuration you have. And then I know you know this, but in case, just to kind of bring some context to all of this. And then of course you can fold it down to a binaural fold down and listen to it in a stereoized version of what the work is. In terms of globally processing, EQ is easy to implement because you can stick a EQ across all objects, and including the bed. In Pro Tools, what we do is we fillet out the bed to essentially channels, multi-mono channels, objects. So we can put the same plugin across everything and link them with automation. So one knob affects everything. EQ is easy to do that on because you can add a dB at 10K or a dB at what have you, and everything just does it accordingly and maintains correlation. Same with level, obviously, just turn everything up and down. Dynamic processing is the hurdle, because if you slap across everything one compressor, that compressor is going to be interacting with whatever it's being fed independent of one another. A loss of correlation, because a kick drum is going to be moving like this, whereas a vocal could be moving like this. And the further you compress or dynamically process, the more warped the mix would become in the mastering process, taking a departure from what the mixer balanced. So it's a very, not a solution for that reason. Dynamically processing and mastering the way we're used to does come with some hurdles. The logical solution, and I have to tip my hat to Stephen Barton, who originally tipped me off to this, and he's not alone, a lot of people use this type of technique, is to take your entire object-based mix, and fold it down to mono. And we call this the mono fold down, which then you can have all your compressors sidechain off of. So now they're all moving in unison, right? Maintaining correlation of your mix, and you can compress.
Why mono and not stereo?
Because there is no stereo in this world, right? There's no channels. So it has to be one, because otherwise, I mean, you could hypothetically do something like that if you wanted to split it into two hemispheres, something like that, but we wouldn't want to do that because we all want everything moving in correlation, maintaining the mix, right? So you do one mono fold down and all your compressors are now moving together. The problem with that is that if you wanted to EQ into a mono fold down, that compressor doesn't know about that EQ because it's triggering off something off to the side, right? Especially if you wanted to hypothetically, and we do this a lot, Gavin and I love doing level rides in mastering where we'll dip down a bridge just to come back to a chorus based off the compression that we're introducing so it can bloom further, right? You kind of have to go away to come back sometimes. Doing something like that while your compressors are triggering off a mono fold down has no idea that you did that with the level. So even though you might be backing off a section, that compressor is still working as the way it always was, not musically related to the work you're doing, as though it was on a bus. We were not too enthusiastic about working the way we'd become accustomed to. So I set out on the mission to try to figure out a way to essentially have our cake and eat it too. And really truly have all the benefits, the musical benefits of having a bus without one. And this actually goes outside mastering too. You can technically mix into something like this using the same principles. I've focused my efforts on a mastering solution, because that's what we do. But it goes beyond that. It's really just bus processing in this format, or any format like it. Today we have a song, and what we're going to do is hear all of the objects. And like I said, if there is a bed, we'll fillet that out into mono tracks. In this case, we have an LFE, right? Which many people use a bed just for the LFE. That's a common mix preference. And I could talk about that also, but for the purposes of this, we'll skip over that. And we have our master chain, right? So it starts with trim, which is level, 2 EQs, one after the other. This is a custom EQ that we'd like to use. This is actually modeled after our EQ in the stereo analog world. This is our own little non-GUI'd thing that we like to use.
That's your own EQ?
Yeah, we custom made that for ourselves with IK Multimedia, actually, as a kind of a standalone part of our plugin, the LMC, as you're familiar with.
Yep.
And then fab filter. So we like to use these two EQs off each other. And then going into a de-esser and into another compressor. And in this song, we didn't have to use this third dynamic process, but it's available to us if we need it. So of course, if you just had these across all channels, not tied to anything, you're going to have a whole lot of correlation lost in terms of your dynamic processing, right? Everything's going to be moving and independent of one another, and how are you really going to achieve a good mastering result? So we take the entire object-based mix and we fold it down to a mono fold down. And I'll scroll down here. It's a mono fold down, right? That is a thumbprint representation dynamically of our entire mix. We're not going to be listening to that because it's going to sound probably not so great because it wasn't really balanced to be folded down to mono, but it is a representation of what we're working on dynamically, something to trigger off our dynamic processes. And you'll notice I've made 3 of these. And the reason I've made 3 is I have one for every dynamic process that we have working in series on the objects themselves.
Right.
So as I was saying before, you don't need EQ. You don't have to trigger off a sidechain, a mono fold down for EQ, only dynamic processes. So what we have here is on the first key, the first mono fold down, it includes and is tied to with automation, level and EQ. Because what would this de-esser, the first dynamic process, want to see if it was on a bus? It would want to see a leveled EQ'd signal because that's what comes before it. So whatever, skipping ahead for a second here, whatever we do to the objects, we do to the mono fold downs and we process them identically. So you maintain that correlation. So if I make a level ride, that mono fold down will be level ridden so that it then feeds the de-esser, which comes on the objects themselves in just that same fashion. And then the second key would include that de-esser, right? So then the output of that, key 2, would feed the first compressor. The input would be key 2 because it would want to see a leveled, EQ'd DS signal. And of course, the third one would have just the same things, except including that compressed signal. So you can build and you can switch the orders, you can do whatever you want as long as your routing is in place. And once you have this all configured, you really forget that you're working in something that's not a bus because it gives you all the benefits of that.
I fully understand now.
Yes.
So presumably, obviously, that can be endless depending on how many plugins you're using.
Exactly. And in any way you want to do it. So mastering engineers can work the way they've always worked in whatever, formulas they like to start off with or any kind of, go-tos. They can switch it up. Age-old debate: compress before EQ or EQ before compress. There's no right or wrong. You play how you want to play.
I've recently been having a very heavy debate with people who are insisting that that you should limit then compress, and I'm like, I don't understand that philosophy at all.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. I haven't done that ever for probably the same reasons that you arrive at that. But to each their own.
To each their own. Yep.
One other thing I want to add: you'll see only on the objects here we have a trim. And that is going to be your master level control. We don't have that on the keys because if you trimmed those down, you'd lose all the correlation. All the feeds would be showing up at the wrong places. So the trim is only on the objects because oftentimes with these formats, you have to hit certain level requirements. So once we get happy with all our processing, we can just we can turn up or down to feed the renderer, or whatever format you're working in, at the appropriate level that you want. Of course, doing that does change the balance of things a little bit depending on how hard you hit it. So sometimes we'll be EQing to our taste, then leveling based off how much LKFS level you have, and then EQing to taste a little further. It requires that type of back and forth. Now, what we found is that really does work. We can achieve all the same musical things that we've always been able to achieve. Makes
you feel like you're sitting inside of the mix. And it's the best way of describing it.
And the reason being is that we're able to achieve through density, because at the end of the day, as mastering engineers, we have the ability to densify things musically and then work EQ into that. So I think that's really the art of what we really do, and that is very difficult to do unless you have a system like this. It's probably in some ways similar to what Bob Clearmountain was doing in terms of mixing into bus processing, right? So this is a way to hit all birds with one stone, but in the DAW,
Yeah, I think what he's doing is a similar-ish idea because it's being controlled from a master bus. He has the two-track mix controlling the surround, but obviously he's not going as far as using the de-essing and the EQing, but it is the compression. This seems like probably the next logical step from that way of mixing. to go and do it like this.
Another thing I want to add is, of course, as you're folding down to mono, you could clip the signal because you're folding everything down to one channel. So working in 32-bit float point is imperative for that reason.
Right.
And another thing to do is I've chosen to turn these down by 9 dB. That's an arbitrary number. Anybody can choose whatever number they want, but as you're setting your thresholds on your compressors, of course, that's going to be tied to that. So as you're starting your go-to templates and all of that, you pick a value, and generally you want to stick with that because that's going to help you start developing your go-tos.
Just for everybody watching, I specifically, Reuben said to me, do you want to know all about it before I talk about it on camera? I was like, no, because I want to understand, I want to have the same experience.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking at it and I'm going, okay, I think I know what might be going on. And then as soon as I saw what you meant by taking the mono bounce down,
Yes.
that was really perfect because yes, if you had X number of plugins on it, you'll just keep adding more of these mono mixes, and it's all about running them in order. Here's a decision that we made on an EQ point, which is now going to affect this compressor. Boom,
Yes.
keys off to the compressor.
Yes.
Now, after the compression with the EQ, that now goes to whatever the de-esser is, et cetera, et cetera. And I know you guys and I all share the same trick of like de-essing and boosting high end at the same time.
Yes.
Where you can make everything feel more open without ever getting harsh.
Absolutely. And in fact, it actually shapes the bottom as well for that reason. It gives you a little bit of support sometimes, depending on how far you go with it, which is a big part of how we achieve some warmth too, without EQing it in there.
Yeah, I agree. We were talking earlier about off camera. You were saying a project, I won't say what it is, but that had some artificial low end dialed into it. And
right.
That's a really, something I always called something sounds EQ'd.
Yes.
You hear some perceptible kind of phase shift where you hear a notch. I learned from Jack Douglas to never EQ the exact area you want to EQ. If you want to get some more warmth in there, come below it, because then you can get a nice gentle slope on it. If you go in and go, it needs more 60 and just boost that 60, suddenly it's like, you just hear 60 come up. Encourage it lightly. So,
Yes. And I learned this from Gavin early on. We do our best job if it sounds like we were never there. You know? And working in these formats, it is tricky if you don't have something set up like this to sound like you weren't there. I mean, that's one of the advantages of having a bus to begin with.
How many channels are there total? I mean, obviously you've got the 3 here, but the actual channels is this being mixed from?
It looks like we have in this particular song 61. Wow. Yeah.
61 all keyed off of this.
Oh yeah, and you can go up to 128.
So you're receiving stuff to master in immersive that's all 128 channels at times.
Up to that. I don't know that we've gotten so many up to that amount, but 61's quite common, 80 very common. If you have an orchestral thing to work on, probably a lot more. Depends on the arrangement, of course.
So there's no kind of 16 channels solves everything kind of thing.
I haven't seen that often. Mostly it's around these numbers. But it really depends on what you're working on, the arrangement, what you have going on in the arrangement.
Wow.
Yeah.
Most guys I know that are mixing, with the exception of like Bob mixes entirely single tracks, but most people are mixing stems. So they're taking guitar stems, they're taking like, bass stem, background vocal stem, all that.
So what we'll receive for mastering is somebody that mixed through those stems, did their coloring to it, did their balancing to it, their processing to it, still full and object based, and then we'll receive that, we'll import the ADM that they provide us, and we'll sweeten it further. And really what we're doing is doing what we do. If we want to, the same type of approach that people know us for in stereo, we'll do that in these formats. This is the way we A/B. You'll see that all of these plugins are linked together. So if I go Shift A and just click on one of the objects here, they'll all bypass in unison and come back. And that's how we A/B before and after using that one. Now, of course, there's probably hundreds of plugins flickering on and off at the same time, but that's what happens. So I'll just play a little before.
vallei, soos 'n backbeat as ek ry, die angel van die dood is by my verby. Ek hoor het weer in die skare voor die son. Ek het altyd uitgestaan, maar nou is ek vermom. Is ek net 'n echo? As jy my roep, as net 'n echo. Of is dit jy wat my soek? Is ek nog hier so? Of is as net 'n spiegelbeeld, 'n echo?
Yeah, it's beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, the high mid taming is really, really tasty.
Yes.
You know, that's what sort of makes me feel like I'm suddenly inside of it, because nothing's kind of like taking me out of it. That's something that really, you know, not a lot of people talk about. There's a lot of low end kind of conversation, but everything, all the information that really allows us to understand one instrument, one person's voice, etc., from another, is all in that mid range.
Right.
And
Yeah.
especially that sort of 3 to 5K area over here suddenly changed quite dramatically. You know, I'm sitting slightly off to one side, obviously, so I'm going to hear more of the left-hand side of the vocal coming out here, and that was huge. It suddenly just kind of like just sat in there, and
Yes.
very satisfying.
Yeah, we use it like a high frequency limiter, you know, and in fact, I enjoy, and I know Gavin does too, lowering it all the way down to around 2.4K. So it's de-essing even the mids too.
Right.
And that's just, you know, part of the way we kind of smooth, as you were saying,
Right.
you know, kind of soften the upper mids. So then sometimes we EQ into that,
Right.
create some openness, but not with a point or any kind of edge. You know, those two things working in concert, which is essentially what we're talking about, bus processing, one thing working into another and having that all work makes sense. So just so you can see exactly what we're doing in this song, we have a trim, and I can turn that up or down depending on how far I want to push signal into these compressors. And of course, I can ride that in real time, you know, verses into choruses. And then we have, after that, these two EQs that work off each other. Of course, we don't need any type of keying off for the EQs or the level, because that is all working in correlation with itself, you know. The only time you need something to key off of is a dynamic process. The first dynamic process we have in this case is a de-esser. So you'll see that that is being keyed off key 1, which is our first mono fold down all the way down here, right? So that'll be, the output of that is going to have trim and both EQs, because that's what comes before the de-esser. And then the next thing on the objects is going to be our first compressor, right? And that is going to see key 2. So key 2 is going to have trim, EQ, plus the DS signal. And this song, we're not using another compressor after that, but if we did, we already have it set up for and ready to go. And of course, this one will see key 3 as its input. So key 3's output is going to have everything before it, trim, both EQs, de-esser, and that first compressor. Output of that feeds key 3. And these are all linked together so we can make level rides, and everything works as it would on a bus.
So everything's being summed to mono from all the multiple, you know, in this instance, 61 tracks.
Yes.
When you're creating these 3 keys here,
Yes.
you're doing a mono master.
Well, the only thing that is useful for is to tie it all together. So we're not listening to that, and it's not going to ever be played. It's just a dynamic thumbprint representation of whatever the mix is. Whatever the mixer left you with, you're folding that down and then processing it in exact correlation in this cascading effect as you would the objects themselves. So the only purpose it has is really to tell the internal engine, if you will, what to do.
Right, but when you're doing this,
Yes.
How are you doing that? You're sitting in a separate room doing a mono master.
Oh, no. No, the mono is just a fold down. We can just bus everything to a channel and print that, and then we just duplicate that as many times as we need based off how many dynamic processes in series we have. Well, technically, we are processing the mono fold downs in the same way we would, just the same way we would the objects.
Sure.
We're not listening to them, we're not monitoring them, we're not making any of our balance decisions while listening to them. All they do is tell how the processes in series, the dynamic processes in series, how they would move, how they would react, because they have to react based off something that is summed, one thing. That's how you maintain correlation, so everything moves in unison as though it would be on a bus, even though it's not.
Right.
So the only purpose for these are to tell the compressors how to behave.
So the settings on this are copied from where?
They're identical, and through automation linking, they're the same settings as what's on the actual objects.
So every single one of those 61 channels has the same?
Yes, same de-esser on it.
Can you do me a favor and click on 61 there?
So the only difference here is that this one has the key input of key 1 because it's on the objects themselves. You won't need that on the mono fold downs. It doesn't need a key input because it's literally working in series just this way.
Sure.
Yeah. It is getting its information based off of everything that came before it.
How are you making those choices? How are you selecting that it's 2.357 kilohertz?
Based off what's coming out of the speakers, just dialing it in as though you would anything else.
Right.
Yeah. So it's just a musical preference, until you get happy.
But then it's identical across every single channel.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, because you're monitoring every single channel being played back in real time.
Right.
And so that is what is influencing our decisions in real time, just like anything else.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're finding a happy medium place on 61 different channels for a decision that works on all of those 61 channels.
Well, it is all we're ever doing is listening to everything all at once. So we're not soloing one thing, we're not mixing, we're mastering, we're doing global processing. So one thing affects everything. And of course you could do individual processes, but that would almost be blurring mixing and mastering. We are respecting the balance decisions of the mixer as though we traditionally would, and only doing global processes as a mastering engineer wearing that hat would do.
Right.
Yeah.
I think what I'm trying to point out is that regardless of the template, this is still going to come down to the skill of the individual. Because what you're doing is you're saying, I've got, there's some high mids coming over here and there's something else coming over there. I want to address, there's two different issues coming at once, and I've got to address both these issues.
Yes, yes. If that were the case, and we'd have to do something on one particular part or one element outside of the global, we would do a little pre-balancing, or we could do something outside and only hit that one. In fact, we could do it before these trims, or somewhere else outside of the global, and just nick that one little object, make it darker. And we could do that. And let's say, because you wouldn't want to...
Have you?
We haven't run into that actually so much. The similar way that actually did happen once, but it was for a different purpose. We do have that ability, but that is almost like stem mastering in a way, to some degree. It would be the same thing, because when a stereo mix shows up on our analog console, we don't have that ability. All we have is that summed stereo mix to work from. Of course, we could get into treating left versus right, or maybe center versus sides, mid versus sides, but that's usually to fix an issue that maybe could be maybe better done on the mix end. In fact, if we're in that position, generally, especially in the stereo world, we'll just call up the mixer. It's so easy and say, hey, if you turn down the snare or darken the snare, we won't have to work as hard globally, and then you can really get so much more from us, because we're not just doing surgical work, you're just getting the benefits of what people rely on us for generally. So it's all those same rules apply here, actually, in just the same ways. Yeah,
it does seem to me, though, you've got so much more individual control. It's like, I know it's not stem mastering, but it sort of is.
Yes.
I mean, you've got that ability. You've never been in a situation before this previously, except for obviously 7-1 mixes, where you've got this many potential tracks to work from.
Yes. Yeah. You can do anything you want. You can individually process these outside of the global process, and you can have that side of it, and also you can have one big global control for anything you want. You can do all of it.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
One other thing I wanted to mention is obviously, because we're folding everything down to mono, whenever you sum something, especially if you're not listening and monitoring through it, it's just a product of whatever you have to work from, you're going to have some bottom end buildup. Right? So one thing that you can do to get around that is your compressors. And FabFilter is a good tool for this, is the compressors on the objects themselves. We have a sidechain, and a sidechain off a sidechain, of not letting these compressors trigger off anything below, in this case, 73.6 hertz. Because if this wasn't here, your compressors would be dealing with all of that bottom end buildup, and they'd be acting a little sluggish, you know? So this tightens it up, and it's just, that's a musical preference, you know? So it's just
No,
something
absolutely.
to...
That's been a beautiful thing with sidechain compression, hasn't it? Over the last, there's been lots of great things that have happened in plugins that have made people go back to hardware.
Right.
Like, I mean, years ago there was never a mix control on a compressor.
Right.
You either compress something aggressively or not aggressively or anywhere in between.
Yes.
But now you can compress something incredibly aggressively, then just dial back how much you use of it.
Yes.
So it's like a parallel compressor in a box almost.
Right.
And that particular feature, I mean, you know, I wish that had been on SSL consoles when I first started.
Yes.
You know, you were sitting there trying to play this trick of getting your low end just right so you could feel it without it hitting the compressor so hard that your whole mix collapsed every time a big boom bass note came in.
Right.
Everything sucked down because of this one note that was coming in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we do the same thing. In fact, a lot of times we'll use the shadow hills in the stereo world.
Yeah.
And we'll use that sidechain feature just for that reason, especially with working on, you know, things like hip hop or anything with a big, big low end. We wouldn't want that getting in the way and causing the compressor to move.
Right.
You know, you just want that tight. So these are just musical decisions, but yeah, you can really play as you want to play. Everybody can do what they want to do.
And that's your preferred point, I would say there, 73.
There's something kind of magic about that area. Yes, it is. It is nice.
Okay, noted.
Yeah. No cheating. So here is our good friend and colleague, Rodrigo Cuenca. He was really the lead in terms of setting up all the technical aspects to our Atmos room, putting it all together, figuring out all the components, and he's here to explain how we set up and what we have here.
So this is a 7.1.4 monitoring room. The main piece of equipment that does most of the heavy lifting is the Avid Matrix Studio interface, which is the main monitor controller for all the speakers, but also takes care of speaker delays, DSP EQ, and levels. Levels are important to kind of get uniform for the medium. In immersive audio, you definitely want to meet a spec a lot of the time to be able to make sure you're monitoring at the right levels. The speaker arrangement is left, center, right, 2 surround speakers, 2 rear surround speakers, and 4 height speakers and a subwoofer. Pro Tools communicates with the interface via an internal I/O system called the Audio Bridge. It used to be that for immersive formats, you would need to use 2 computers to be running, one for the receiving end and one for the playback Pro Tools end. With this setup, what you can do is actually do it all within one computer. The caveat there is that you need a really powerful computer. In this case, we're using a Mac Pro. With immersive formats, you often need to fold down also to listen to binaural versions of your mixes and masters, and that can also all be done via this interface. The software that's used to control the interface is called DADman, and it's been around for a long time, but it's extremely flexible. You can basically route your digital signals and your analog signals going out to the speakers wherever you want. It's connected via Dante, which is also a very kind of new way to connect things digitally, in that it can carry a lot of audio signals at once and it can send them both directions. With that, you get a pretty complete system, and it's very flexible, and you can change it around for whatever your session needs.
A big part of our setup, in order to accommodate the horsepower required to run Phantom Bus, which is hundreds and hundreds of plugins all working at once, you need a lot of processing power. So for that reason, we need a very powerful computer.
The interface, also the Matrix Studio, can take Pro Tools HDX cards, which can offload a lot of plugin processing and just let you run, you know, as big of a session that could ever possibly exist.
Just to further what Rodrigo was saying about monitoring through the binaural fold down, it's a very important part of our workflow. We listen on the full array and make all our balance decisions while monitoring through the full array, but also we use Audeze headphones because they're extremely revealing, very musical sounding. They just sound fantastic. They're great tools, and we monitor through that as well, make our balance decisions on both places, the full array and the binaural fold down. And when we listen to the spatial, Apple's spatial format, we listen to the AirPod Maxes for those decisions as well.